man a king, every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others. There's enough for all people to share. When it's sunny June and December too, or in the winter time or spring.
Thank you, Brian. I'm happy to have be joined tonight by 4 distinguished guests, and I'm going to let you catch up on their histories for the past 8 years or so, but I want to introduce them first. Jerry Luc LeBlanc, who was a Commissioner of Administration in the Blanco administration. Rochelle Michaud Dugas, who's a former Legislative Director. To my immediate right, Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff, and she'll update us on her progress over the last 10 years or so. And John Hill, who of course we all know is a journalist. A distinguished journalist and now a consultant. I feel like he's a competitor. But we soon will turn our attention to, though, the administration of Kathleen Blanco. And as we know, Governor Blanco is vital to Louisiana history, and we're going to explore some of the reasons, including the things that we will remember her for: economic development, race relations, natural disasters, education, and some of the things that we will discuss in some great detail. We spent an hour yesterday on the telephone to catch up with each other, but also to review some things that we wanted to cover tonight, and all of us, I'm sure, went home and dreamed and woke up and thought about things that we wanted to be able to stress again tonight. As a refresher, though, I think it's important, especially with an election just a short time away here now for governor, that Kathleen Blanco was elected governor with 52% of the vote. That was 730,737 votes to Bobby Jindal's 48%. More than half of this will be a comparison for this upcoming election, more than half of Louisiana's 2.7 million voters in those days cast ballots, which was a higher turnout than predicted. She carried 53 parishes to Jindal's 11 parishes, and originally there were 17 candidates in that October primary, the first primary, and Jindal finished with 33%, and Ms. Blanco had 18% in that first election. So that's just a refresher. I think the first question that we want to get into, and I'm going to start with Jerry Luc and Rochelle, and that is Kathleen Blanco first entering politics. In 1984, she was elected for the first time, where she stayed until her election to the Public Service Commission, serving from 1989 to 95. She won the first of 2 terms as lieutenant governor in 95, and then ran for governor in 2003. And I'm going to say it before anybody else does, that she is undefeated in her political career to this day. But as recently as yesterday, there's some other very interesting things about her background. And Jerry Luc, when she first got started, census taker came up yesterday as something that you all remembered. So why don't you kick it off with that memory?
All right, thank you, Malcolm. This, like a lot of stories in Louisiana political history, this is where it gets kind of twisted. So, in the beginning of Kathleen's political career, her beginning and my beginning are kind of entwined. And my father, who served in that same district, he elected in 1983 not to seek re-election. My mother was ill at the time, so he elected to stay home. And then that was a decision that Kathleen made to enter into the race, and that was a very heated race in 1983. Well-financed opponents. Kathleen ran a grassroots campaign, kind of hand-to-hand combat. She was successful and became the District 45 representative. If you fast forward 4 years from that point, my dad, for whatever reason, made the ill-fated decision that he wanted to run again. And and the reason I say that is because there's this long-standing impression that Kathleen and I have been in the same political camp all these years, and that's not exactly correct. So, he ran, again, he was, I advised him not to run, but if you knew my dad, he was a rather hard-headed kind of guy and wanted to do whatever he wanted to do. So he ran and she won 60-40. You fast forward again, there was some discussion about me entering the race in '83, and I didn't want to do that. I was building a business and so forth, and I just didn't want to have an interest in it. You fast forward 5 years, she runs for the Public Service Commission, vacates the 45 seat. That's when I ran and got elected. And then to get even more twisted than that, and I'm going to try and be quick because I know we're limited on time, one of my principal opponent was a really good friend of their family, and so it really got twisted. But I will tell you something about Kathleen Blanco's personality, and that is the day after I was elected, we lived in the same precinct. We lived right around the block from each other. She walked over to my house with the District 45 state representative license plate and graciously gave me the plate as a passing of the torch. So that was that tells you something about who she is. We fast forward, and over that time, she became Lieutenant Governor, I became Chairman of the Appropriations Committee. We started to work together and developed a mutual respect as to what her motivations were. She came to understand what my motivations were, and then that kind of started the process off. But she very much started her career as a grassroots, working with the Census Bureau, house-to-house kind of thing, person to person, and she was, and that's kind of how it got started.
Thank you, Jerry. John, tell us about your first time you.
The first time I saw Kathleen Blanco, she was in the Bennett Johnson's headquarters here in Lafayette during the 1971 governor's race, and she was very pregnant. And she and Raymond had bucked the trend of Acadiana to support their friend Bennett Johnson. So I think that's her entry into politics, because you start learning what's really going on when you're inside a campaign.
Yes, a question too, and I want Kim and Rochelle to comment on this. How do you think her background as an educator, homemaker, informed her work, everything from legislator up to governor?
Malcolm, I think it's interesting that, as everyone has said, her earlier terms, but from the very beginning, she was a trailblazer. She blazed the trail for many women, as she had many firsts. She was the first woman elected to represent District 45 and go to the House representing Lafayette in the House of Representatives. Following that, she was the first woman elected to the Public Service Commission, and she was also the first woman elected to chair that commission. Immediately following that, she spent 8 years as lieutenant governor and was the second woman to hold that office. And of course, that brings her legacy, to an end or to a fold as the first female governor.
And I would say, in terms of being an educator and being a homemaker, she, of course, had a very pragmatic approach to the work. She was policy focused. She certainly understood the importance of education, having been a school teacher, and talked about education as poverty's mortal enemy as we worked on solutions to poverty and all of those things. So I think that obviously she was very, very committed to the state of Louisiana. She understood the connectivity between strong education policy and a stronger community and stronger families. And she was very, very practical and pragmatic about the work. She led with the policy as opposed to the politics, and was very focused on getting things done for the right reasons for our citizens.
We're going to come back to that whole notion of policy over politics as we go through this evening. I do want to get into the campaign, discuss the 2003 campaign, which Brian has pointed out was a historic campaign between a female candidate and a non-white candidate. And so I want to discuss here, and I'll toss it up, what were the keys to Governor Blanco's strategy, the winning strategy as it turned out to be? And who were her voters?
So obviously her strategy was to mobilize the state. She, of course, I remember looking at a quote that said the lieutenant governor is a poor launch to being governor, and nothing could be further than the truth. So obviously she had very strong Acadiana roots, her Cajun roots. Remember doing commercials in French, she had told me about that. She had a strong African-American base of voters and Catholics as well. And then she had this base of the small communities that she had worked with Main Street, Main Street work in the lieutenant governor's office. So she understood the value of every community and every citizen and every household as she approached the work. So I think that was important as she went about, talking with voters across the state.
In some of these campaigns, you try to, people will make a claim that they visited a certain town that maybe you would think would be off the beaten path. And so I remember at one point talking about the governor visiting Shreveport. It was an unbelievable number of times, like 72 times over the course of the time that she was lieutenant governor. And so those are the kinds of things in terms of maybe not consciously campaigning all the time, but being around so much that people certainly recognize you. Jerry, you remember the campaign?
Well, yeah. The striking point of the campaign is the ability and the feeling that when she moved in any town, any size group, small to large, people connected personally with her. And they felt that she connected personally with them. And you could see it at every stop, every speech, interaction with the crowd. There was that personal connection, and people felt genuinely that she was interested in what they had to say. And there was always that connection, and I think it speaks to the personality. There was always that attempt and that realization. She wanted to genuinely connect with the person who was talking to her at that moment.
Rochelle, you saw her virtually every single day during that campaign.
And we did cover every corner of the state, and we did meet with everyone, whether it was a CEO of Fortune 500 company, or if it was the Rosary Group or another group that were just mom and pops. And that's the beauty of Governor Blanco. She is inclusive, she's remained inclusive, and she has touched every person in the state, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of politics.
There was a moment that we in the media saw as a defining moment in that last week of that campaign, that runoff in Bobby Jindal, and it was at the debate. And the last question of the debate, my friend John Dennison asked, he said, "What is the most defining moment in your life?" And Bobby Jindal went first. And he was happy talking about getting married and having babies and delivering all this kind of stuff. And I knew what the defining moment in Raymond and Kathleen's life was because I was there when it happened. And they turned to her and she told the truth, that it was the death of a child and how it had strengthened her. That night, I called around to all my friends and all the CBS affiliates and other affiliates around the state. And every single newscast at 10 o'clock led with that, all over the place. And so then I called Vern Kennedy, the pollster who rolls pollsters around, and he went back and he looked at that debate time, and I think that debate was from 7 to 8. And he said the shift started coming in the 8 to 9 hour, and was even more in the 9 to 10 hour, and even grew that day. Because there was, her contrast was here as a human person versus an automatic talking machine. And it's played out in the history of Louisiana in the last 8 years, the same thing. It's almost an inhuman lack of empathy for the people of Louisiana in this last 8 years that she didn't have. She was a real person, and everybody in the state of Louisiana saw that moment of realness in a politician, which we don't see very often.
In contrast to maybe what's happening in the current campaign, in terms of the type of paid advertising that was being invested in those campaigns in those days. Of course, those were the days before the super PACs. But in my own reading about the campaign, even recently, it was certainly not as nasty as you'd see some campaigns here now. But let me just remind you of some things, the twists and turns that happen in a campaign. The Ray-Nagin endorsement, does anybody remember that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Endorsed Jindal, right?
Yes.
The lack thereof.
And, you know, just as I was thinking,
Where it lacked pride of coverage.
so the question I would ask you is, as you recall that campaign of personalities, or was it a campaign of substance, or was it some combination?
Certainly a combination. As we were talking about yesterday, such a broad cast of characters. You know, I think about looking at the Republicans debate now with, you know, the stage is huge and they've got the kiddie table. And when the governor entered, there were so many men in the race, and she distinguished herself not only because she was a female in the race, but because of her commitment to policy and the conversation that was there. So I do think that it was a substantive conversation. I remember, I thought you were going to talk about the flair of the commercials. You know, the Cajun music, the crawfish, you know, the granddaughter coming, you know, her daughter expecting the commercials that were shown. So that was something else that just sort of distinguished her as well. But definitely, I thought it was Jerry?
Yeah, I agree.
John, you have a comment about it?
Well, you know, we've got to, the truth be told, the whole lot of people in North Louisiana thought Bobby Jindal was a black man. He corrected that over the Blanco's administration by traveling around to all the Christian right small rural churches all over North Louisiana. But in the beginning, I remember Greg Tarver, who was a black senator from State's Trooper, said they can't vote for him up here because they think he's a black man. They're not ready to vote for a black man for governor. So I think that may have been a factor.
I want to come back maybe sometime about that. I want to respect the time here, but social media and the internet and those things we haven't covered yet, but we may be able to come back to that. But Kathleen Blanco was elected with the numbers that I mentioned earlier. The New York Times on January 13th, 2004 covered her inaugural speech. Significant quotes all, but she took the oath of office from State Supreme Court Justice Catherine Kitty Kimball in English and Justice Jeanette Thériault-Knoll in French. Right. One of her memorable quotes was, "Today marks the first time an honor like this has been earned by a daughter, a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. Louisiana is open for business. She looks forward to creating economic and educational opportunities that will enhance the lives and careers of Louisiana residents." So let's talk about the formation of her leadership team. Jerry, we were talking earlier about the fact that you and others were getting a head start on that with the reality that, you know, that it was a great possibility she was going to win. Talk about those days and what that pressure was like, which was a different kind of pressure than a campaign.
Right. So, gentleman by the name of respected attorney Jeff Jenkins, he was involved in the you know, the day-to-day campaign apparatus, and so together we were asked to plan contingencies, and I think all campaigns plan for contingencies. So, you know, we started to formulate, okay, if you win, then what do you do the first 7 days, or what do you do the first 30 days, what do you do? And so we, you know, he and I got together, we consulted best practices and started to formulate what that early initial transition would be like. And of course you plan for the other alternative as well. And so the numbers come in, we're at the Lafayette Hilton, where is the headquarters, and after the election speeches and celebration and hoopla, then we immediately retreated into the suite upstairs, and there were 5 of us in the room. Myself, Jeff Jenkins, the 2 ceremonial chairs of the transition, and the governor-elect, and then went about stipulating okay, what's going to be done? How are we going to how are we going to kick off the transition teams? You know, and the biggest thing was we knew that, as recommended by National Governors Association, everything else, a governor-elect from the campaign needs to kind of decompress for 6 or 7 days. And so that was all planned out, and we just systematically went at it and got a game plan. And that was, I don't know, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning that we did that game plan, and then had a press conference the next day where she, you know, started to kick things off.
Rochelle, talk to us about the difference between campaign and transition into the administration, first days of the administration. And earlier we had talked about her style of direct communication. Talk about that a little.
She was consistent the entire time, not only when we were building our staff, but when we were building our legislative leadership, to even when we were appointing boards and commissions. She was very strategic in that effort. She wanted to make sure that everyone in the state was represented. And with that, she wanted to make sure that every geographic pocket across the state was represented. She wanted to make sure men and women were represented. And she also wanted to make sure that blacks, whites, Hispanics, all folks were represented. In doing so, I think history tells itself that her staff served her well throughout the administration, but her legislative leadership was also very impressive and was there with her every step of the way.
Kim, talk about her management style. When it came to communication, she was pretty direct. What's the management style? Was she a micromanager?
Absolutely not. She was a person who surrounded herself with people who were very capable. She had high expectations, and she expected us to execute. She certainly had an open door if you needed to talk, if you needed to visit. She was collaborative. She would bring the team together, certainly Jerry, Rochelle, others, to talk about big issues. There were lots of big issues for us to chew on and to think about. She heard different perspectives, different points of view, and then would, question those, ask about the facts. She was very deliberative in her conversations, in her thinking, fact-based, wanted to know all sides of the issues, and then we made a decision and moved forward. And so it was a delight. It really was a joy to work. We had some interesting times. And then I was listening to Rochelle talking about the legislative leadership. So of course, I have my Queen Bee pin on, because we did have an episode where the legislators decided, and Joe Salter's there laughing, that we had a chair who was not following what the speaker had asked. And so I think the conversation occurred for the governor and the speaker, and they said, the chairs need to be in lockstep on these issues. They're very important. They're part of our package. And so we did have a committee chair who was removed and complained that Louisiana had gone from having a kingfish to a queen bee. And so everyone said, let's think about that. And the governor said, let's get the queen bee pins out and let's embrace that, because we do want to make sure that people are heard. It was not heavy politics, but there were expectations. And if you didn't meet the expectations, there were consequences. So,
John, what was the media thinking in those days between the inauguration and that first session?
Well, I had a meltdown on them. They kind of isolated them a little bit. Isolated themselves because they had a lot of work to do, and I wanted an interview and I wasn't getting it, so I just had a temper tantrum and I got it.
Some things never change.
But they were working very hard. They were out at LSU, and it was really intense. It seemed like to me it was a very long period of time in your transition. I think it was shorter than usual. Is that the year? Was it really short or something like that? So I mean, there were a lot of people coming and going, but you had to sort of sit out there and kind of pretend that you knew what was going on as you saw people going in and out. They were very much in control, except when I threw my temper tantrum.
So we go from the inauguration, the early days of the administration, the placement of administrators, the selection of legislative leadership into a special session in March. Several $100 million of programs and services were in the governor's budget proposal. 15 topics were up for debate, mainly some of those would be tax issues. What was that first? Oh, and then she got into the ethics legislation, banning campaign contributions to legislative and executive branch elected officials during regular sessions and extending that past 30 days. Jerry, you had a lot of experience in the legislature. What was the going like in those days?
Well, it was an ambitious agenda, but you had a lot of ground to make up. There were so many moving parts just because of the circumstances, and so you had to develop a really quick game plan and implement. Not unlike what's about to happen in the next administration, whoever gets elected will really have to hit the ground running because there are some difficult issues on the horizon as well. But she remained calm and steady, wasn't even keel temperament, would just take it in, process it, well thought, was not over deliberative, because some folks who have occupied the office will overthink a policy to death. She understood the linkage between the policy and the budget, and that was really important because a lot of people can have their initiatives torpedoed because they haven't considered that linkage. So it was an ambitious and a very successful session.
So she had 3 sessions from the time she was elected and inaugurated until the Katrina season. And Rochelle, tell us about what you think of some of those legislative successes. It seems, I think it's, and going back into some of these news reports over those years, it seemed like the track was set for a really good term in terms of getting things accomplished. The scorecard was going to look really good.
And I think this at the end, I think the scorecard was excellent. We worked on education issues that she put out on her campaign platform. Healthcare, we addressed those. She promised a healthcare summit. We took off, had the healthcare summit. We heard from everyone. Everyone was at the table. We had doctors, we had nurses, we had patients, we had technicians. Again, she was all-inclusive in her efforts as she addressed the issues that the state was facing on healthcare. We, of course, had budget issues, and she, together with Jerry Luke, handled those, and we had a good budget that was balanced. Economic development, she was nonstop with economic development, not only with legislative issues, but with the department and with her missions, both inside the state and outside the state. Again, she was all inclusive. She worked tirelessly, and the leadership, again, we were talking about the leadership and how much support we had. Our leadership came together, particularly when those packages came up. And as we went off, she deliberately looked at the list of her campaign platform and of the promises we had made and checked them off. And we were attacking each one individually in a strategic manner.
John?
She was very tenacious when it came to industrial inducement and attraction of new people. I remember the Union tank car thing where worked on it and lost it, and it went to Texas. But she didn't stop. She called them back and said, you know, we still have this wonderful package here for you if it doesn't work out for you over there. Well, it didn't work out for them over in Texas, and Union Tank Car came to Louisiana because of it. And I think that was a point of illustration of what sort of tenacity she had when it came to industrial inducement.
And Kim, what about it?
The other thing I want to add to that is she took on policies that she knew would make a difference for the state, not necessarily policies that were sexy politics. I remember being in the trenches on the juvenile justice work because she really knew that we needed to make sure this was not the farm team for hardened criminals in our state, that we needed to make sure there was rehabilitation and training for students, young people who had gone the wrong way. And so we were focused on that, and we worked hard on that. She, as a former teacher, stood strong with teachers and made sure that we thought about making sure that teachers had strong pay raises. She brought higher education to the SRB average for the first time in 30 years. Lord knows we'd like to have a conversation about that right now in higher education. And I was listening to you talking about the inauguration speech, and I know everyone here will remember when she took office in the inauguration speech, she said she wanted to be the governor to bring our children home. At the time, it was an economic development commitment. And then, of course, with Katrina and Rita, it became more of a commitment to bring our people home from that destruction. But she was very focused on economic development, and she understood the continuum between education, early childhood, remember we kept LA4, that work, need-based aid, we started that program, and then workforce. And then she also was very focused on adult education. So that full continuum to make sure that families and communities had stronger support was important to her.
So things were going totally in the right direction. Pretty much everybody would agree with that at that point.
Yeah.
Then we had a natural disaster that turned into something that we're going to dig in and talk about here right now, and that was Katrina, which was a central element in the Blanco term. And it's impossible to separate the politics, so I'm going to start with, let's start with the preparation. Let's start with the evacuation process. Let's talk about what everybody felt that storm would mean to Louisiana, and then what happened after it hit. So in terms of preparation, Homeland Security, FEMA, there were news reports in advance of the storm that this was going to be a serious storm. Anecdotally, I think many of us got calls from either you or other people high up in the administration to tell us, who were down in New Orleans thinking it was not going to be that bad, to take off and go. You have to evacuate. John?
Yeah, well, I had been in New Orleans, I think on a Thursday before Katrina hit. On Monday was the Cultural Economy Summit in New Orleans. I've been there for that, and I have a home in New Orleans, so I stayed there and gone out to Herbsite and got up early the next morning. It was my pattern to come back to Baton Rouge to work. And I was sitting there working around there, and on Thursday night at dinner, we were sitting around there, we were talking about how terrible it was that all our friends over in the Florida Panhandle were going to have to evacuate again. That was on Thursday night. And on Friday afternoon, about 3:30, I guess, 4 o'clock, Roderick Hawkins in the press office called me and he said, I know you like to leave early on Friday afternoons and get down to New Orleans, but you need to stick around. And I said, why? And he said, the governor's declaring a state of emergency. And I said, what for? And he said, you haven't been watching TV, have you? And I said, no, what's up? And he said, it looks like the hurricane is going to affect us a little bit more. It was on Friday, though. So I called up Terry Ryder, the governor's executive counsel, and asked him exactly what does it mean for the governor to declare a state of emergency. And he went through the things about setting up the process to getting federal aid quickly down to Louisiana after the storm. And it was done as a precautionary measure so that it wouldn't have to waste any time, that it all could happen. And then the Karl Rove White House machine started working because everybody went very sour on George Bush pretty quickly at that arrogant picture of him looking down at the people of suffering in New Orleans that day. And so they came up with blame the state and local officials. And one of the things that appeared, I think, on the Sunday after the storm, so it's like 10 days after that emergency declaration had been signed and sent by the governor, the Washington Post, in a front page story, said the reason the federal response was so low is that Governor Blanco had not issued the required declaration of emergency. And I thought, what the hell is this? This is the Washington Post. They took something out of Karl Rove's mouth in the White House. It was in the public record in Louisiana that it had happened. And they didn't even do and it spun out over in Fox News all that weekend. It just became true. And it was false. It was in that hurricane. I had a 38-year media career, so it pains me to say that I've lost faith in almost all the media, but I have. I no longer subscribe to newspapers, which I think John Williams and somebody was shocked to hear that. But I mean, the newspapers are really bad these days. And, you know, you get your news from Twitter and from New York Times feeds and things like that on the internet, but not from a newspaper, because when you get something from a newspaper, one, I'm not sure that it's true anymore. And two, I've already read it 2 or 3 days earlier in some other electronic form. But the media that came in here, and we call them parachute journalists that come in and drop in on things like this. Never believe parachute journalists when there are any disaster websites, because they don't know what they're talking about most of the time. I remember the person say, here I am standing in Jackson Square in the heart of New Orleans' Garden District. You know, Fox News was just so full of errors that was, you know, nobody in their right mind who wants to be well informed watches Fox News. But CNN was just as bad. They were really, I mean, I was there, I lived there, I had a house there, I knew what was going on all over that town, and they were just misreporting right and left and everything, and they were following along the White House trek where you feed information to a reporter and they report it as if it's true, and it's not, for political purposes, strictly for political purposes, and that's it.
Jerry, tell us what it was like inside the Capitol, coming to grips with the budgetary impacts, the devastating loss from your perspective.
Well, we were not in the Capitol for a while. We were held up in the Emergency Operations Center because you just can't fathom, like he says, the crush of people, both FEMA and media, and just pretty much overwhelmed the facility to begin with. But we had been, the facility was up and running for days in advance of the storm. I mean, everything had been mobilized, everything was up and running. There are so many stories that have been documented, you know, to the insisting that Ray Nagin evacuate the city. Governor Blanco had to go down there herself in order to have a face-off with Mayor Nagin to get him to do the right thing. And so it was an extremely difficult time because you know, there's a lot of lessons that have been learned obviously since then, but the whole ability to communicate, interoperability between law enforcement agencies, and so there was so many things that. And the federal response, and it was really interesting, and we could do just a session on that. But it was really interesting to watch those people that descended onto the Emergency Operations Center, how many White House, Bush-connected operatives who were infiltrators that showed up at the Emergency Center offering to help mediate between the state and the White House, and they were just trying to get information for the
smear campaign,
the media machine. Yeah.
Well, one of the key issues at that time that she had to come to grips with is whether just to essentially turn everything over to the feds.
Right, and so there was a 36-hour. And it's strange. I had this conversation with someone about a couple of weeks ago. We spent 36 hours arguing over what's known as the Posse Comitatus Act. And the Posse Comitatus Act, basically was an 1887 act that had to do with removing federal troops from the occupation of the southern states after Reconstruction. And then it dovetails back, and we all, you know, the White House is throwing this. We want you to waive the Posse Comitatus Act, which basically says that you cannot use federal troops for police action. So they wanted essentially to turn over the National Guard and state police and everybody else under federal control, which went against the Posse Comitatus Act, which dovetailed into something called the Insurrection Act of 1807. So we had to get a real history lesson very quickly. We looked at Terry Rod, the Executive Council, and we were saying, what? What is that? And so, you know, we went back and forth, and it was a very tense 36 hours, and they were having this discussion, and and the frustrating part for us is that we knew there were people on rooftops
Still.
and we're having a discussion about whether or not they were going to respond unless we turned over control. And then other governors kind of started to respond and call her. Well, they were concerned because they heard that they wanted to waive posse comitatus, and they were concerned about what precedent that would set. So it was a...
I think eventually all other 50 governors signed a letter saying she was right, including Jeb Bush, that she was right. They were wrong. I was in New Orleans on Thursday after the storm, and there weren't any federal troops there. There were a lot of National Guard troops there, and they were driving school buses. There were wildlife and fishery agents. There was the Cajun Mafia. There were Louisianians saving Louisianians, and the National Guard was doing a great job. There, I walked through the convention center at dusk, and those people weren't screaming and hollering and carrying on. And they, I think the TV people put them up and made them do that. They have divided themselves into small social groups, about 125, 150. They had staked out turf. The men's latrine area was here, the ladies' latrine area was here. Parents took time sleeping and watching children and that kind of stuff. They were taking care of each other. And they had some supplies. They were meager supplies, but they had good supplies. But they were taking good care of each other. I took in a case of water and I gave it to a woman once, and I said, "Here, take another." And she said, "No, give it. You might find somebody else that needs it more than I do." So there was much better scene down there that was portrayed in the national media.
But I do think we have to say this was the issue, and this is the troubling fact that history will bear out. Issues of race and poverty and politics trumped America helping Americans. Now, as American citizens, we had an expectation that the federal government would respond. A storm that is the biggest and most destructive in our nation's history, and you have questions around 1800 legislation and politics. And people got to see firsthand in this country what poverty looks like, what happens when you leave people on rooftops with no one to come and help. And they don't care about what paper you signed and what's going on. They're going, where's the help? We are American citizens. Why is politics trumping this issue of recovery?
Rochelle, it was part of your task when the governor addressed the legislature. That was a dramatic moment that evening, I think it was an evening, when some of the actual members of the legislature who suffered losses, total losses, escorted the governor right into the chambers. What was the mood of that evening like, set against what Kim just described as there were terrible losses still being experienced at that time?
We were still in search and recovery mode. We were still, all of us were, again, this enormous disaster, all of us were trying to do the best we could with what we had, the resources we had. Again, a lot of us were doing things that we weren't normally trained to do in the search and recovery mode. The legislature, particularly those from New Orleans, were, some of them had lost everything. Some of them did not have the personalities and the demeanor that they had prior to the storm. And the thought process or their behavior was a little bit different at that time. While everyone wanted to help, and of course they wanted to help, and they could see their families and their constituencies suffering the same things that they had suffered. But at that point in time, while everyone was doing the best that they could, they didn't feel it was enough. So the mood was quite dim.
And just as we all started to wrestle with the reality of what post-Katrina was going to be like, Katrina's evil sister, evil twin, as
Rita.
described, Rita, hits. And I asked this question in our preliminary meeting about, did the feds do any better? Were we better prepared? What were there similarities between Katrina and Rita that we could take advantage of after Rita, or did we get whacked again because it was a different part of the state that was affected?
Well, I think the plus side of that was, as Jerry mentioned earlier, the interoperability was beginning to to be resolved. So we were communicating better, and there were better communications. But other than that, you still had the partisan politics. You know, with the feds, you still had all of the other issues. So we were moving right along, and we were communicating better because we'd worked out the kinks in the interoperability, but we were faced with the same type of disaster.
Yeah, the only difference was is that you had more feds that were actually in Louisiana, had been shamed into coming, and so you had more of them here. It didn't make it any easier because the process to get any help was still filled with one impediment after another. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we realized early on we were pretty much on our own, and that was a shocking realization for a state in the United States to be basically, you're on your own, good luck.
Exactly.
The question I want to ask is, has state government learned its lesson in relationship to the feds? Have the feds learned anything about this where this kind of a situation could never occur in our nation again? Do you think it could? I'm saying that in the face of the political environment that we're all looking at on a national level, but one of the takeaways from LEH in this is to think about, you know, how a next governor comes in and whether some of the things that have happened here that we've had to overcome could ever occur again. John?
Well, the federal government's got, the presidents from now on have got to know, because George Bush is a role model for what not to do, because his numbers went south and they never came back up after that. Number one. Number two, I don't think you're going to have, I can't remember what that man did. It wasn't had anything to do with disaster management. He was a horse trainer or a horse judge show owner that had no knowledge whatsoever about disaster management. Michael Brent, at the helm of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, knew nothing, zero. And I remember the governor telling me that she came in there and she said, exactly, the buses are on the way. That he told her, the buses are on the way, the buses are on the way. And this, I think she said, maybe Tuesday after the storm, Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday evening, something like that. And she said, well, where are these buses? And she found out they were in Kansas or South Dakota, somewhere way away. And I remember Bob Mann expressing the fact that she bolted through a door so fast, she thought those doors were going to burst open, and said, all right, get out, we got to get every school bus in Louisiana down there. And I remember they're saying that school bus drivers, by the way, I was in New Orleans. There wasn't all that killing and shooting going on there. Everybody said it was. But the bus drivers, as I recall, came down there and handed over the keys to their buses and say, I'm not going down there. I'm too scared to go down there.
Well, the other thing is, you look at what has happened in this storm, mega storm since then, Sandy and others. You don't have the layers of debate about should we rebuild New Orleans. We don't have the layers of all that conversation. So I do think John is right. I think that the bright light of dissent and concern and disappointment has caused people to pause about, the response. And certainly, Louisiana has rewritten the book on response. We had to do it because the Stafford Act, and Jerry and I talked about this, it just didn't fit a mega storm. And you had people who come in legions of people trying to follow their rules and regs that they had, and not looking at the sensitivity and the realization that this wasn't going to cut it. This was just too massive for that. Not to even mention that once you finally connected with someone to say, now do you understand our issue, they would change the person out. So you had new teams of people coming on. So I do think that there are lessons learned. Unfortunately, we had to, walk that path, but someone had to do it. And there are many people who I've heard say, if Louisiana had to be in the biggest storm in our history, thank goodness we had a governor who cared for her people at the helm. Because at the end of the day, she did say to us as a staff, don't worry about the fight with the White House. Fight for our people. We are going to be focused on our best mission, which is taking care of our citizens. And if we have to beg the White House 47 times, we're going to do that. We're going to swallow pride and do that and focus on our citizens. And that is what happened.
But it was a threat that got the last $3 billion. She went to the White House. I remember because I interviewed her by phone. You were with her, weren't you? I thought so. After they came out, she went to the White House and she was sitting in the meeting there with the top people. And I think Andrew Card by this time was the chief of staff, is that right? Came into the room and she said, y'all have injured me as much as you can. You can't do anything else to me. So if you don't start treating my state as equally as you are to your Republican states, I'm going to declare war on this White House. You know, you can't hurt me anymore. So I'm going to tell everybody and do it. And I think Andy Cord sort of had enough sense to realize that that could be rather more damaging to them, and that's when the money came. Is that right there at that meeting? Is that correct, Joe? That's what I thought. So I mean, when people say that she's a soft woman and everything like that, she's not.
But even with those lessons, you asked the question. I think it can happen again.
Absolutely,
I
as
do
long
too.
as they have
I
partisan
think it can,
politics.
if the storm is big enough,
Sandy.
Politics are
I think it can, I absolutely think, I don't think the country is there yet. If you have a mega earthquake or any kind of substantial natural disaster, I don't think the structure of Homeland Security is there yet. So I think you after having been through what we were through, you kind of critique the next disaster.
Sandy is the evidence of that.
Oh, yeah.
Because all the Republicans jumped on Governor Chris Christie because he had the audacity to thank Governor Obama for getting a disaster aid to his state.
And that really is that's the underlying question here, is that in cases of total disaster, just devastation, does politics ever take a back seat to rescue, policy, looking forward, saving people? Or is it always about politics?
Federal or statewide?
Well, I mean, you saw the example of Christie and the president, and there was a certain reaction that the federal government had in that case that was more responsive and different, what many people would say, and yet the underpinnings of a Republican in a Democratic state by other Republicans was very interesting, I thought. So the general question is politics always part of this flavor?
In the words of Kathleen Blanco, when I once asked her how she was always able to beat much better financed Republican candidates, she said, I can always depend on Republicans to overplay their hands. And I think that's what will happen in another big disaster. They'll overdo it.
Do you have a comment?
No, I was just going to say politics should not be the lead, but I think as long as you're dealing with people who are elected, that's going to be an unfortunate reality.
The two other issues I want to cover before we run out of time, and Brian's being very kind here right now. Are we okay, Brian? Okay. There was the big decision in 2007, the big decision not to run for a second term. I'm interested in your personal reactions to that and how that was fashioned for the public and what the reasons were for that.
So I would say that first and foremost, you had a leader who said the politics are distracting from the work. And so once again, I need to make sure that as Jerry is refashioning the budget, the governor's refashioning the budget, trying to put the budget in the right priorities, education first and other things, coastal restoration, the things we needed. You had a minority of legislators who were beating on every single issue and trying to make every issue around re-election. And so she said, enough of that. We're going to silence that issue. We're going to focus on the right policies, and we're going to take the distraction of the politics out of it in terms of my efforts to run again. Obviously, it was a very tough decision. You know, the governor has a history of putting others first and putting the state first. I know that all of us, and certainly she was exhausted from the fight. And you know, when people are good people and they offer themselves for service, it's such a disservice to see them offered for sacrifice. But that's the reality of what happened. And so I think once again you saw her say, hey, let's lead with the policy and not the politics and move on.
Jerry?
It was certainly disappointing, but not unexpected. I mean, because, you know, that's, again, I agree with everything that Kim said. That's how she processed each and every issue. You know, what's the right thing to do? What's the best thing to do?
Right.
What do I do that first?
Rochelle, you were very close to her on a day-to-day basis. What was that time like?
You know, everyone has said it real clear. again, she is always true to her word. She promised certain things. She wanted to make sure it was about the people and it was about the state. It wasn't about her politics. So at that time, again, everyone was exhausted. Everyone was working as hard and doing everything they could to bring the state back. And it was a hard decision, but it was a decision that was made, you know, in the best interest of the state.
Getting back to the politics question, would she have had to do less in recovery in order to fashion the politics that it would have taken to get things to the legislature or with the electorate? You see what I'm saying? There was a struggle there between getting things, get the recovery going, get it underway, and you know, politics is a distraction unless you put that first, and she didn't.
Exactly, and in terms of a campaign, that does take time, you know, and it would have taken time away from the efforts that she was spending. And it wasn't an 8 to 5 effort. It was a 24/7, 365 effort. It was one of those efforts, and she worked that way before the storm. But after the storm, some of us didn't go home for weeks. You know, we showered at at Homeland Security. We slept on a cot. And she was right there beside us. And it was a choice: either make the state a better place than when I leave than when I got it, or play politics, particularly the partisan politics that she was going to be facing from the feds.
John?
I just remember the interview I did with her the next day after she announced that she was leaving office. And we were talking about important things, and I just got down to one last question. I said, if you could do anything over, what would you do? And she looked at me and she said, well, I would change my registration to Republican, because I learned that Republicans took better care of their own than me. And so I stopped the interview at that. I was falling off the chair laughing. But you know, it would have been a very hard battle, and one of the reasons was Katrina, and one of the reasons was that so many Democratic governors, electors from New Orleans, voters from New Orleans, were sent out of state. And that's one of the reasons we haven't had any statewide elected officials elected who are Democrats. This might change this time, but anyway, I remember telling someone one day, who was a Democratic political operative, I said, you know, 100,000 people from the 9th Ward have gone off to all over the country. I don't think they're coming back to vote in the next election. And, you know, people are coming back to New Orleans now, though. And some of the younger people that were getting there aren't Republicans either, you know, so it might change this time.
Final question to consider, and that is, what will Governor Blanco's lasting legacy be? What are the things what can future governors learn from her administration? And I'll just throw out some things that we have not touched on tonight, but we've talked about before. Not only balanced budgets, but surplus, teacher pay, economic development, GOSEP, juvenile justice, interoperability. Those are the kinds of things, commitment to economic development, education. That's a pretty good legacy.
It's a great legacy. You know, as I think about that question, I know that there are many times when people will self-describe themselves as an education governor, but here's a person who just quietly went about the work of doing that. And they're just, you know, that whole continuum, as I have said. I do think that history will tend to always connect, obviously, the governor to the twisted sisters of Katrina and Rita. But the fact of the matter is, some things, as a result of that storm, we were able to do. When she and Cecil had a conversation about New Orleans schools and just misery of New Orleans schools over decades of students just not being served at all. And so for her to say, you know, we're going to change that. We're going to take this on and we're going to have better choice. And I remember in the storm when kids were enrolling in school after the storm, there was a national story about that. And she said to me, parents will know what to ask for because they will be enrolling their kids into strong schools across this country. And they'll come back with an expectation of what great schools look like. So for me, I think her legacy will be education, because education is foundational. It is work that will continue. And the other thing I would say is that in terms of what others can learn, she looked at what was good policy, whether it was a previous governor or 2 governors before, and said, if it's great policy, let's make it better. Where lots of people will say, not my thumbprint, I want to change it because it was not my administration. And so she had a commitment to doing the right thing with policies and a continuum of that education work.
Jerry? She was proud of that.
Excuse me.
Go ahead, John.
I was just saying along the educational level, being a denizen of New Orleans now, there are actually public schools in New Orleans that people want to send their children to. And that didn't happen before Katrina. She dismantled the New Orleans public school system, created the Recovery School District, went into the charters, and that's made a huge difference in New Orleans.
Jerry Luke, balanced budget, surplus. I know both of you are proud of that surplus you passed on. Why don't you go ahead and talk about it?
Well, yeah, it's, again,
How much was it?
$1.8 billion. I mean, $1 billion gets reported, but there's actually another account that another 800, right, Mr. Salter? You know, Mr. Salter
That was the sinking fund in the house.
yeah, that's right. But you know, it was because we had strategic fiscal policy. We made strategic investments in critical needs. And yet we had to have some budget discipline because of the uncertainty of the shift in the economy in Louisiana. And so, you know, people can judge $1.8 billion takes $1.8 billion takes some effort to generate $1.8 billion.
Effort or skill?
Well, I don't know. I'll leave that to somebody else. But you know, $1.8 billion is $1.8 billion, and you know, that's the last time we've had a balanced budget in 8 years. I think in terms of legacy, and you already start to hear that now that we've had a degree of separation from the Katrina, Rita disasters. She's going to be known as a compassionate, engaged tactician as governor.
Rochelle?
In combination with all of those, I think instead of being remembered by the disaster, she was a trailblazer for women across the state. She was, of course, the first female governor, and that should be her biggest legacy, because that will always stand true. But the other thing is the governor will be known to have left the state a better place than when she inherited it at the end of her term.
John?
I remember a friend of mine taking their daughter to the inauguration, saying that she was a Republican, but she wanted her daughter to know that she could grow up and be governor of the state of Louisiana. And I think that's it. You know, she inspired a whole lot of daughters around the state of Louisiana.
Okay, that's a great, thank you. Great summary. We do have time for questions, Brian? Yes. And how is this going to work? Okay. I guess we should have said that. Maybe you did. This is being recorded.
Mr. Speaker?
Yeah, let's have a statement.
Of course, my claim to fame would be the fact that I was fortunate enough to be the seatmate of Governor Blanco in 1986. And of course, people have heard the story, and it's true that she had called me and asked me if I'd be interested in running for Speaker, and I said, well, that's not really something I'm interested in. And I knew that there were some other folks that probably, and one of them's on the stage here tonight, that if he decided he wanted to be Speaker, he'd have been Speaker instead of me, which would probably have been fine too. We worked out real well. But anyway, I did agree that I would seek the post with her support. And I remember that one morning after I'd agreed and I'd called members, and I know she had been working and other people had on my behalf, had a knock. I was in B9 in the Pentagon Barracks, and there was a knock on my door. I went to the door, and there were two, I won't call their names, but there were two members of the House. They came in, and they said, "Look, Mr. Joe," that's what they call him, these two, Mr. Joe, said, "We've decided we're going to go a different direction." I said, "Is that right?" They said, "Well, yeah." I said, "Well, let me tell you what you do. Why don't you think about that overnight and come back tomorrow or as soon as you can, because if I can't count on you, then I need to get somebody else that I can count on." So sure enough, the next morning, knock on the door again. Those two came back, and they had seen the light overnight. But it was a, I think her legacy will be, as has been indicated here tonight, one that faced adversity and did a great job, really, in facing that adversity and those difficult times. To me, there's a great difference, too, between, even though they're the same in both catastrophes, there's a difference between what happened with Rita and what happened in New Orleans, in that in New Orleans there was such a greater number of people in a compact area who were adversely affected as opposed to, what took place in Lake Charles and Cameron. That's not to say that it was any less dramatic or devastating and so forth, but to me, you just can't compare the two. But I saw that, she had what was best she wanted to do what was best for the state, and certainly made that decision not to run. But there's no doubt in my mind that based on that first year and a half, we were clicking on all cylinders. It was go. No question in my mind, particularly had the storm not come, that she had been reelected for another term. And I've heard a lot of people say that since that time other than me. But again, I think she did a fantastic job. I'm not sure that no matter how you prepare or things of that nature, I don't think it's possible to do enough to get ready for a disaster like that when you have a tremendous number of people who don't have food and don't have water. So, there's some criticism of folks, well, they didn't prepare, they didn't do this, didn't do that. But again, I think it's just an impossible task to be as ready as you need to be in a situation like that. But I think she did a great job. She was a great governor. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions?
Clay?
Oh, here we have a question. No, a comment. I'm sure it's a comment.
I've been listening to two things. She said I have to get up. Treat me like a little kid.
Well,
John Hill. I think that I have a view of Kathleen different than everybody here, especially at the table. I know this lady away from politics to be the most selfless, not selfish, selfless human being. I'm sure there are others who share that and have those great qualities, but it's never about her. And I think the big thing politically to understand is every governor has had their defectors. This crew and others, there's no defection in Kathleen Blanco's crowd, whatever you want to call them. And that's unusual in politics. Is that right, Jerry? I mean, everybody has the bad mouth and the this, the that. I've never heard one of her top people say anything about her, and I never heard her, for sure, you were not allowed to judge any of her staff. Not that I would.
Oh, yeah.
But that's the Kathleen I see. And it's right now we have visitors in from Minnesota, and she loves each one of those kids, and they're 4 little boys, and their mama's here, and It's amazing to see her running the machines, helping the daughter get settled, and all of it selfless, never complain. You gonna speak? I'm not doing a good job. What's the story here?
Well, I want to thank the panel, first of all, and tell you that you never know what anybody's going to say when you get invited to something like this. But I am very proud of my work and the staff that joined me in that very, very hard work. And I'm proud of my family and the support that I've always gotten from them. It's you need that support. And our visitors, as Raymond just called them, or 4 of my grandsons and a daughter and her husband who are moving back to Louisiana from Minnesota, where they were sort of sent because I was governor. They had just gotten their master's degrees from Ole Miss and could not accept a job at any university in Louisiana, and their master's degrees were in education. And so anyway, it's taken 12 years in Minnesota and 3 out of Mississippi before they could come home, but they are now home. And I do want to tell you that my team was made up of some of the brightest people in Louisiana. And then my backup team over at the state police, and I see some of them here, was also made up of some of the brightest people in Louisiana. I have just always enjoyed surrounding myself with really smart people because you don't have to babysit them. You tell them what needs to be done, what your vision is, and you just say, go do it. And that was my great experience. And then my relationship with the media was always pretty good too. I made the rest of the folks very jealous when I was told by the White House I could pick one media person to travel to Baghdad with me, and I didn't know anything about how the media operated, and apparently I was supposed to pick an AP person who didn't belong to a specific newspaper or television organization, and I chose John Hill to travel into the war zone with me. Now, we both could have been killed, you know that. And so, but I came back and they were very, very upset because he worked for Gannett. And, you know, it just worked out. But John covered the trip and we both escaped tracers, yeah. Well, sniper fire tracers, because our plane, C-130, went straight up, and our stomachs were in our throats as we were getting away from the dangerous elements out there. And the state police, y'all weren't with me, Chris, you know. And but anyway, it's been quite a journey. And I want to add to my legacy. I always wanted to be the education governor and the economic development governor. But I am the governor who set the stage for a proper recovery. And the battles in Washington are legend. And will it happen? Will politics always overcome? As long as we have these extremely partisan people, yes. Yes, there will always be politics to deal with. I think that it was particularly extreme in our case. And I want to tell one quick story. The $3 billion that I got from that meeting that John was referencing with Andrew Card was, I just said, have you ever met a woman who had nothing to lose? Well, you looking at one. And I'm going to declare war on the White House. We did get that $3 billion as a result of that. But at the end of my term, I mean, I could have just gone home and left the rest to Bobby Jindal. But I didn't want to see, we didn't have enough money. We needed $4 billion more. We had gotten a little over $6 billion in the first round. We got $3 billion more. And we needed $4 billion more to complete this recovery effort. And so I went back to Washington to meet primarily with the Democrats who were now in control. And I told them that we were going to have a Republican governor, and that, you know, and I knew what was going to happen. The Democrats were going to deny money to Louisiana to punish, just do what the Republicans had done to me. And so I said, no, I'm coming early. I want you to give the money to Louisiana because we really need it before my term ends. Therefore, you don't have to give it to a Republican. But after I dealt with the Congress that was now in control by the Democrats, I ran into one of my friends from Lafayette who was in Washington, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, well, I came here. I was very annoyed about having to come back because it's always so miserable here. But now that the Democrats are in control, I think I died and came back Haley Barbour. Now I know how he was treated so royally and so wonderfully, But, I want to say that me and Mary Landrieu were the guiding force. David Vitter had embarrassed himself. Republicans did not want to be seen with him. It was a pretty tough time for Louisiana, so we essentially had one senator that we could depend on, and she helped me immensely, along with Nancy Pelosi and some other members of Congress. We had some good Republican members from Louisiana also who helped us. That would be Rodney Alexander, Jim McCreary, and Richard Baker. Charlie Melanson was fighting for us because his area had been devastated by Rita and Katrina, and Bill Jefferson had done a banner job. But it was such a political fight when it should have been humanitarian. But I can tell you, when you look at what's going on in Washington, it will repeat itself, and I'm really sorry about that. And it shouldn't. It should be about the people when it's always going to be about their politics. And they got punished for it, and they should have learned those lessons. But I think those lessons are hard for some people to learn. Thank you. And thank you so much for being here tonight. I appreciate it.
Every man a king, for you can be a millionaire. But there's something belonging to others